Jim Cornette needs to manage the revival in AEW, and we'll tell you why on this episode of the Squared Circle Psychobabble. My name is Michael Valenti. This is Ralph Valenti for news, reviews, and conversations on all things pro wrestling. Subscribe, hit that bell for notifications. So we got the news on Friday that the revival were released from WWE. We talked about that. Link is in the description below on our conversation about that. But since that news broke, there were some people talking about Jim Cornette joining AEW to manage the revival. And one person talking about it is Ryan Satin. He went onto Twitter lobbying this, but he got a lot of backlash for it, Ralph. So do you agree with Ryan Satin and those that say that Jim Cornette should manage the revival in AEW, or are you those that say this shouldn't happen?
Well, unpopular opinion probably would be that they don't want Jim Cornette to represent the revival if they were to go to AEW. But given all the backlash and the hate is exactly why, and a part of the reason why he should be the manager of the tag team if they choose to go to AEW. Now, wrestling is predicated on the fact that you have good guys and you have bad guys. There are guys that you're supposed to cheer, and then you have guys that you're supposed to boo. Now, granted, it's the year 2020, and certainly they've blurred the lines between good guys and bad guys. It's not necessarily as clearly as defined as it once was. And certainly there's a much smarter audience to what's going on. There's very few secrets, and there's very few things in professional wrestling nowadays that actually feel real. That's a problem, especially given now you're starting to see those things because you don't have an audience, right? You don't have that extra element of, fans that are willing to boo or cheer somebody that's guiding the people that are watching at home to, ultimately make a decision whether they're going to like somebody or hate somebody, whatever the case may be. But the worst possible thing you can have in professional wrestling is a wrestler who comes out and gets absolutely zero reaction. You need controversy. You need storylines that people are into. You need something that feels real, organic, authentic. Jim Cornette has not held back any punches as it relates to the Young Bucks about the shortcomings of AEW. And that really, really pisses off a lot of people, specifically the diehard fan base of AEW, New Japan Pro Wrestling. Your really, really hardcore fan base of professional wrestling probably is going to be pissed off about a lot of the things that Jim Cornette has to say. That's exactly why this needs to happen. There is nobody who's going to be able to generate more authentic heat from the crowd. There's nothing that's going to grab the attention more. There's nothing more that's going to get the fans to get the hell up off their asses and actually react to something and not just sit back and chant, "This is awesome," the same repetitive bullshit. I'm talking about legitimate nuclear heat, something that you don't have in professional wrestling anymore unless you're really damn good at what you do. Even Paul Heyman, as good as he is, doesn't generate heat in the traditional sense. He's good at getting a reaction, but there's still a very, I would say, large subset that's still going to root for Paul Heyman. This is a guy that will walk in the doors at AEW and get the type of heat that you haven't seen in professional wrestling in God knows how long. That's why this needs to happen. That's why this will be special. That's why it will work. It's not something that people need to look at as a bad thing. It can work. It will be successful.
I totally agree with you. This definitely needs to happen. I know Jim Cornette has talked about this on his own podcast as far as a month ago and said basically the ship has sailed just because of all the things that happen in AEW and the things that he gets bashed for all the time for saying that he doesn't like that people like, that he will criticize guys like Orange Cassidy, that he criticizes Marco Stunt, that he criticizes the Young Bucks and the lack of tag team rules in the tag team matches. And this is all stuff as ammunition that can be used for a storyline, especially if you want the revival versus the Young Bucks. Now, as a diehard wrestling fan, a lot of people are calling the dream match the revival versus the Young Bucks. Everybody wants that match. But for those, casual fans or those lapsed fans, there's got to be more than just, oh, this is a dream match, because they might not know who the revival are. They might not know who the Young Bucks are. They'll know who Jim Cornette is if they're wrestling fans from the 80s and 90s and even the early 2000s. So when you bring in him, you're bringing in some of those fans back and expose them to AEW. Everybody wonders, why can't AEW get 1 million viewers? It's because they don't tap into that older audience. Look at their ratings. It's always bad in that 50 plus demographic. A guy like Jim Cornette might be able to drag in some of those viewers and get them over that 1 million bump. And the other thing is, as the great Eric Bischoff always says, controversy creates cash, okay? Who creates controversy in the professional wrestling world today more than Jim Cornette? Nobody. Whether that is the controversy that he has on his podcast, what he says on commentary, what he does on Twitter, everybody talks about Jim Cornette. He's so polarizing, and that's, basically the reason why John Cena was so huge in WWE for 14 years is because he was so polarizing. That's what wrestling needs, is that polarizing character that people are going to either back up or totally hate, not be this everybody loves him or everybody hates him. Jim Cornette's a guy that just is you either love him or hate him. There's no middle ground with Jim Cornette.
Yeah, and certainly I think one of the things we should probably say now, because I know somebody's going to make the comment, how could you support him? He's this, he's that. Look, I don't agree with 100% of all of the things that Jim Cornette has ever said. Certainly he's been accused of making racist comments. He said things that have rubbed people the wrong way. I'm just talking about the things that he says about AEW and the people like you talked about, Marco Stunt, Orange Cassidy. I mean, it's almost like he's been building up towards this. And, people will say this all the time about Jim Cornette. He is in his element. He's just trying to push his narrative. He's just in character. Let's assume all of that is true. Let's assume that all of this is him being, who he is turned up to the highest level. So he's actually setting the table for something like this. That's exactly what you probably should be doing. That's what you should be doing. So that way, when you actually make your debut, whether you're a wrestler or you're a manager, like, people are caring and they're reacting to what you're saying and what you're doing. Like you pointed out, John Cena, a guy that is so polarizing in the professional wrestling industry, whether he was booed or cheered, at least he got a reaction. There's so many guys, whether it's on Raw, SmackDown, AEW, you look at them and they're like, they're so good in the ring. I don't know why they're pushing them. I don't know why they're not pushing them. I don't know why he's not getting his big break. If you're not getting a reaction and you're just good in the ring, that's not good enough anymore. I'm sorry, but it's not. There's a million guys that are really good in the ring. There's a million guys that are under contract across New Japan Pro Wrestling, Ring of Honor, whatever company you want to point to. And a lot of them can do the same stuff in the ring. And there's certain guys that are very good in the ring, but they just don't have the talent to get a reaction or to get themselves over because they don't have the mic skills. Jim Cornette will have nuclear heat. You brought up Eric Bischoff. I mean, in the professional wrestling industry, one of the things that you can certainly say is never say never. There's been guys that have cut ties with the WWE, didn't necessarily work out for a little bit, and they ended up coming back to do the Hall of Fame or work WrestleMania or whatever the case may be. Eric Bischoff, the guy who almost literally tried to put Vince McMahon out of business for good, tried to put the nail in the coffin in terms of WWF and where they were and shut the doors for them and for a lot of other wrestlers, had a very prominent role in WWE and WWF up until, what was that? Not even a year ago. So never say never in the wrestling industry. It's not necessarily a bad thing just because the guy says some controversial things about your favorite professional wrestler. Who gives a shit? Get over it. Too bad if you don't like everything he says. That's exactly why this needs to happen, because there's so many people that aren't heels and can't work the gimmick anymore to the full extent. The heels that come out and they got a cool catchphrase and you're chanting along with them. That's not a heel. That's not a bad guy. That's a guy who, comes out and can get over with a certain demographic, and people think I'm in the same boat. I'm the same guy that's going to go out there and chant for certain people because, I'm not always going to cheer for the face. But this guy will come out, he'll get great heat, which is something that's desperately missing in professional wrestling nowadays.
It definitely is. I mean, when you think about it, when you truly think about it, how many wrestlers in today's industry actually get heat for being heels? MJF, Baron Corbin.
Baron Corbin.
That's it. Those two, really, when you really think about it. Because even Jericho at first was getting heat, but now people are singing along to Judas. And, with Jim Cornette, whatever he says, it's going to get a boo. It's going to get heat. And especially with the Young Bucks. And this is the other thing that's great. The best storylines in professional wrestling are usually the ones that blur the lines of what's real and what's a work. This here, we know it's a shoot with him and his opinion on the Young Bucks, but some people might not know that, and they'll be like, ooh, this is really interesting how he hates these Young Bucks so much. I just want the Young Bucks to beat the crap out of the Revival just to piss off Jim Cornette and get the reaction out of him. That's what's missing.
Not even that. Not even that. Imagine this. Jim Cornette comes out for 2 months straight, cuts these promos on the Young Bucks. The Revival get the better of the Young Bucks, whether that's them, some physical altercations. Jim Cornette's really embarrassing them. He comes out, he cuts these promos on Marco Stunt, Orange Cassidy, Kenny Omega, all of them, the whole row of them.
Yep.
He's just going out there week after week after week. Finally, at the biggest pay-per-view that's sold out and there's millions of people watching all over the world, they get their retribution and the Elite get to do their finishers, or they get to do a super kick party on Jim Cornette. You mean to tell me that's not something that's worth waiting for? If you're an AEW fan, if you're saying no, you're lying to yourself. You know it's true. You know this will work. It's just that he will say certain things about your favorite professional wrestler that you don't like, and a lot of people don't like that. Well, he's got a different opinion than you. I've got a different opinion than some other people that watch professional wrestling. That's fine. You can have a different opinion. That's something that's desperately missing. People can't accept criticism. People can't be open-minded. It's either you're all AEW and you think WWE sucks and there's no middle ground. Well, I'm sorry, but there has to be a middle ground. You have to be willing to accept the good with the bad. Jim Cornette, while a bunch of people won't like this initially at first, he'd draw mega heat, and you'd be cheering your ass off if the Young Bucks got him in the ring and started kicking the shit out of him.
Now, one last thing, one big point that I want to point out here is one of the goals of AEW is to prove that tag team wrestling can main event in big spots and big pay-per-views. Who better to push tag team wrestling than the guy that praises tag team wrestling and is more passionate about tag team wrestling than Jim Cornette? This guy talks about the Rock and Roll Express ad nauseum and the Midnight Express and all these classic tag teams like the Road Warriors and how tag team wrestling could be good today, and talking about examples like the Revival and put them over and get heat for them as heels just by being with them. If you have that be the biggest storyline in wrestling, not just AEW, but wrestling in general, you will draw in money. You will draw in tickets. You will make that tag team match the main event at whatever pay-per-view it's going to be. That's why Jim Cornette needs to manage the Revival in AEW in a program with the Young Bucks. The question is now, if this happens, which I know Jim Cornette said it's not going to happen, but never say never. When do you do it? When do you pull the trigger on this? Do you wait as soon as the crowds go in, or do you let the water simmer a little bit and wait, let's say, a year to next year's Double or Nothing?
Well, that's the hard part. I would say as soon as they're allowed to have crowds, crowds come back in. Once you're allowed to have live events in front of an audience, that's when something like this would need to happen. Because like we talked about in our last podcast or our last episode, especially for a situation like this, you want the crowd, you need the crowd. You're going to need that nuclear reaction when he comes out, or if he comes out, very much like the reaction that you got when Eric Bischoff debuted in WWE. A lot of shock, a lot of people that were going nuts for the situation. That's when I do something like this. So I'd hold off until that time, because this is really one of those situations where you need a live crowd and that reaction to really capture the full extent of this type of moment that it would be.
Now, I would debut him that first show, whenever that is. If it's going to be All Out, if it's going to be, an episode of AEW Dynamite, whenever that episode is, that's when I introduce Jim Cornette and the Revival to get that shock value of like, oh my God, they're finally here. And then you let Jim Cornette have like a pipe bomb type promo where he just lashes on everything he hates about AEW, get that heat, and then let that go all the way and arc through the winter and let it culminate at Double or Nothing. That's how I see it. But the question is now, when are crowds going to be back allowed in shows? The current plan is August. That's the current plan, and we talked about that in our last episode. You can click the thumbnail on the screen right now, also in the link in the description below. Don't forget to share this all over social media. Let us know if you think Jim Cornette should be in AEW. Tell us why in the comments. For news, reviews, and conversations on all things pro wrestling, subscribe. Hit that bell for notifications. For Ralph Valenti, my name is Michael Valenti. Thank you for watching the Squared Circle Psychobabble.